I'd like to thank you both very much for being here, first of all. It's both a great pleasure and a great honor to have you here. So, especially a stage I was fortunate enough to perform on. I want to kind of start from the beginning, if that's okay. I primed my watching of this episode with a couple of the prior episodes, or 2 prior episodes. And Mr. Stone, the first episode, we talked about using the series to answer questions. What questions, if any, remain unanswered for you, and for you as well? So, at the culmination of this and having traveled around talking about it at great length with a great variety of people, do you have any questions that remain unanswered that you wish you could have answered?
I mean, no, I'm happy with it, and I think for me it's a combination of my film work, because I've done a lot of stuff, dramatic stuff. I started to go more towards documentaries in the 2000s and done interviews, but this was the first formal documentary I've ever done. It drained me. It took off and on 5 years. It was expensive. A non-profit endeavor, but certainly worth it. The worldwide reach of it has been pretty good for it's a progressive piece, radically altered look at America, pretty radically different, as you can see from the atomic bomb mythology. So when you're doing that kind of stuff, it's ungrateful work. I mean, you're digging in a deep mine. It takes a long time for people to change their minds. A long time. Although I think I've done it abroad in other countries, and there's another perspective about it in Russia and China, obviously, and also other places too. And we've gotten very nice receptions. And here in the country, we don't get any media mainstream, but we really seriously, we don't even get on PBS, frankly. We can't get on National Public Radio, which is insane. But typical of a country that's changing. However, we work at it, and we go to the colleges and we go to the high schools. With the books getting around, we have a .com, Untold History.com, which is for teachers especially, run by Eric Singer, and we have a new edition called the Concise Untold History of the United States, which is based really on these 12 hours, the text of this series. And that's 400 pages, less than 400 pages. It's a little quicker reading, and I think very interesting reading. The main book is 800 pages, with 130 pages of footnotes. I consider it more of a primer. So, and the 12 hours are out all over the world in various forms, Amazon and on DVD and Blu-ray. So, we've done our best. We keep doing it. Can't keep doing it forever. Hopefully, the other generation will pick up on it.
I also wanted to say thank you, and it looks like Professor Kuznick has a comment, so I'll shut up and turn it over to him.
I'll left one thing out, and that's we also have a young readers book coming out in early December for middle school students with 10 to 16-year-olds. So we're trying to reach people in as many ways, at as many levels as possible. And that question you asked about what do we not have the answers to, one that we get asked all the time is, how do we change this? You know, we can do a good job. I think we do a great job of pointing out what we've done wrong over the years, over the decades. But the question that haunts us always, that people want to know the answer to, is how do we change this? You know, considering the forces that we're up against, the forces that created the world that we have are enormously powerful. They're armed to the teeth. They control the media. They try to control the school systems. Every level that we're dealing with, we've got these tremendous institutional forces that we're up against. And what happens is people feel defeated and become pessimistic. I think that the world that we have now is the only way it could have turned out, that there's no way to change it. So in our real mission and what we do, the reason why we make Henry Wallace such a central figure, we want to show people that the world did not have to be the way it turned out, and that there is still a possibility of change, and there are movements all over the world, including the United States, that have the potential to make those changes. And that's what we've got to convey to students at universities, middle school, high school, people out of school. And we need to not lose hope, and do what we can to make those changes. I can go into that a lot more later.
Well, actually, why don't we go into it now? Because I was actually going to ask, because I watched the whole series when it originally came out and rewatched a bunch of them in anticipation of this, and it is really a central part of the narrative that you tell is not just these alternate histories or what might have happened if, for Henry Wallace had been vice president, but also kind of pointing to the power structures that make that happen, the party bosses that are referred to in this episode. And I would love to hear you talk more about how you see those functioning right now in the 21st century, and how projects like this and other projects that you're probably aware of bring those to light and then create possibilities for discussing and, where possible, undermining those systems. It's just so easy, but it's quick.
I can close it.
We look at what we're up against. Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower was a bit disingenuous in doing so, because if anybody was responsible for having created the military-industrial complex, you could say that Eisenhower was the main person with the forces behind him. When Eisenhower took office, the United States had 1,000 nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower left office, we had almost 23,000 nuclear weapons. When his budgeting cycle was finished, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons. So there are forces like that. And one of our other episodes, our Vietnam episode, which is one of my favorites, we could close with George Kennan's secret memo that he wrote in 1948. Kennan was really the architect of the Cold War containment policy. In that memo, Kennan says we have 6.3% of the world's population, and we control 50% of the world's wealth. The challenge facing us in the period ahead is how to maintain that position of disparity. And we're not going to do it by talking about freedom and democracy and civil rights. We're going to do it by pursuing hard power concepts. And that's what this whole Cold War was about. That's what American history since then has been about, maintaining that position of disparity, maintaining American power, American wealth, American control, hegemony. So we're up against some serious things. But most of the world does not approve of that. And most Americans, I think, if given choices, would not approve of that either. And that's why we're trying to give them choices, by showing them the history, by deconstructing the fundamental myths that they've been taught in schools. This project, as Oliver could say, grew out of our concern about George W. Bush in 2008, but also grew out of Oliver's concern about the education that his daughter and others were getting in this country.
Yes, today I'm particularly despondent. It's Sunday, I guess. So I'm going to. I think it's as Peter says. It's so colossal a force. It's gotten stronger since World War II. The acceleration of the national security state was extreme, and the perversions of myth that they put out there to justify was extreme. But it got even worse after the Soviets went down in 1991. There was no reason anymore to continue that purpose to fight communism, which was the world, going to dominate the world. But it didn't stop, and there was no peace to end. And I guess the 1990s were interesting, but they were confusing. And in hindsight, we went to war right away with Noriega, and then again with Hussein. And then in 2001, of course, we reached another plateau. Unbelievable concentration of power, pure power in the state, to become a global security state, very much wanting to dominate the resources of the world, dominate and control the world. That's where we are now. I mean, we are after China. We're surrounding China. We're surrounding Russia. We at 13, we've expanded NATO, contrary to our agreement with Gorbachev, to 13 countries. We would like to get NATO into Ukraine and Georgia. So there's no question we're out to destabilize those two regimes, as well as Iran, of course. So and the surveillance state that Snowden has definitely proved existed, although many people knew it happened, it was around since 2001 and 2. That surveillance state is just enormous in its power and its ability to acquire any kind of information, sexual, financial, political, or simply about terrorism, but that's simply one of the many activities it does. So, how do you sum it all up? Nietzsche was right. Nietzsche was right. He said the will to power. And that there is nothing more naked and blind progressive and raw and destructive at the same time as the will to power. Germany had it, and we had it. That's my Sunday. That's my Sunday feeling right now.
Nietzsche also said one other very important thing, a lot of important things, but one other that I want to mention. He said, insanity in individuals is rare, but in nations, parties, and epochs, it is the rule. And I think if we look at this period in our history, it's a period of somebody looking back. If we exist 1,000 years from now, we look back at this period, it's a period they're going to define it as insane. A period in which we're governed by our fears. You turn on CNN, turn on the other networks. First it's ISIS 24 hours a day. First it's the plane crashes 24 hours a day. Then ISIS 24 hours a day. Then Ebola 24 hours a day. We're being driven mad with fear. And out of fear, countries do crazy things. They respond in very dangerous ways. And that's what we're from now.
Do you see the idea of American exceptionalism, which comes across here, and Wallace is sort of an outlier on that, right? But how do you explain, if you will, the contrast between your approach and mainstream history that seems to me reinforces a lot of the important prevailing narratives to maintain this theory of American exceptionalism? What are the forces at play in the writing of history that you've come about and you've been exposed to through this experience?
Give it a crack.
Well, this episode is a great place to start. Because what we do with our first 3 episodes, and 4 episodes really, is we deconstruct this myth of American exceptionalism. And we look at World War II, because that's where so much of it starts. We can trace it back to the city upon the hill, and Winfried Sermon aboard the Arbella in 1630. But in the more modern version, we look at World War II, at 3 fundamental myths that come out of World War II. Number 1, that the United States won the war in Europe. People believe that. Ask any of the kids in high school who won the war in Europe. It's the United States. The reality, as Churchill said, was the Soviet Union tore the guts out of the German war machine. The Soviets faced 200 German divisions alone throughout most of the war. The United States and the British faced 10 combined. Soviets lost over 25 million people in World War II. We lost 400,000. It's terrible, but you have to really put this in perspective. The second myth is that the atomic bomb ended World War II. When, as we show here, and I think very persuasively, the Americans, Truman especially, knew that what was going to break the back and the will of the Japanese was the Soviet invasion. Truman said that all the time. Finny Japs when that occurred. So he knew they were trying to surrender, and that's what really made the difference at the end. And number 3, that the Cold War started during and after World War II because of Soviet aggression. We deconstruct that myth also. But the 3 of them together are very dangerous and allows the United States to say that it is the world's force for good and freedom, and we're benevolent, we're altruistic, we're different than everybody else. They're all out for greed, or they're out for power, or they're out for land, or geopolitics, but we're motivated by this desire to spread freedom and democracy in the world. I think it's a very, very dangerous notion. And so that's what we're up against. We've been confronting this myth of American exceptionalism throughout this project.
You ask why exceptionalism? It's a very interesting idea. I think we explored it in chapter 2, and also about the immigrants who came here. The oceans are so big, and they come from regimes that are countries that have difficulties, whether it's in Europe, poverty, or religious war, or South America. They're fleeing from dictatorships or poverty again, or Asia, much violence. These come here, and there's a reconstruction that happens. You see it time and again. The immigrant looks at this as a pure land, this is new land, this is some heaven that he's arrived at, and there's this untoward fear of the old land. And we don't want that in this country. I think there's a lot of that goes on. They're blocking off the truth. The reality is you come from some place, you've got problems. You're going to another place that also has problems. But it always gets a little bit passed on in the genes, so the second generation sometimes is worse than the first generation. Not as grateful. and sometimes a third generation, fourth. So it becomes encoded in our television, in our worship of military, our worship of the flag. The flag, I've never seen such worship in this country. The flag, maybe since the old days of the 30s in Germany, but the flag means so much now. You have to wear it on your lapel to prove that you really are serious with the politician. So, I mean, I wouldn't worry about that. It's just extreme nationalism. And it's short-sighted and self-love. And I think that's how that grows, this embrace of exceptionalism, although I believe the original people who wrote this kind of stuff really believed it because they were purists. Try to find a few now. I guess there are a few left.
If I can continue on the more purely historical track, as I heard myself.
Say again?
If I could continue on the more purely historical track, if I may.
There's no purely historical. There's economic, it's social, it's sexual, it's purely historical.
But on the discussion of kind of the way that the war is being, the manner in which war is being fought now, changing consistently and exponentially following war's launch and technology growing. Ernst Jünger, when he wrote Storm of Steel, this is a memoir about World War I, he talked about the dehumanization of the enemy during war and the mechanization of war. And with things changing so much and so continuously and so quickly, would you say that Otto von Bismarck was right when he said that the great decisions of our time will not be made with speeches and ideas, but with blood and iron? Or do you think there is room in our future for diplomacy rather than just erasing each other from the face of the planet?
A lot of people feel that Bismarck, unfortunately, begat the monster. That's what
I think, let's use what's going on in Ukraine or in the Middle East right now, that as an example. In approaching all of the problems we're facing now, whether it's Ebola or Islamic terrorism or global warming, the fundamental things that we as a species are confronting, these are not American issues, these are worldwide human issues. What we need is a worldwide human response to some of these things, which Obama doesn't seem to get. One of the things we love about Henry Wallace was that he had that rare ability to see the world through the eyes of our adversaries. He could see the way it looked to the Soviets, and he tried to prevail on Truman over and over again. He stayed in the cabinet for over a year as Secretary of Commerce, tried to talk him, to convince him that his Cold War confrontational policies were wrong, to understand how the Soviets see the world. Obama's not much better at it. That's one of the things we thought that Obama would be much better at than he has been. But it's a rare ability in American leaders to do that. In 1942, when Roosevelt made his speech, a public statement said we're going to open up the second front in Europe by the end of 1942, which we don't open up until June of 1944. He also talked about the need for the four policemen. He said that the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and Britain are, after the war, are going to have to maintain the peace. It will be the four policemen who will work together to maintain the peace afterwards. I think what Obama needs to do is have a global summit now, which would get together with the Chinese and the Russians. We can forget about the Brits, but maybe the Germans, and begin to actually, because all these are problems that face all of us. So instead of putting together our phony coalition of Sunni states in the Middle East to confront ISIS, this is something that we can deal with as a global community. So these are all global problems that have to be dealt with as a global community, which means we have to back off on our provocative policies in Ukraine. We have to back off on our Asia pivot trying to contain China the same way we try to contain the Soviet Union after World War II. We have to, again, become part of the world community instead of trying to be the hegemon. And I think that then we can begin to make some progress, and other countries will want to work with us.
Well, I had a question about the theme or the topic of dissent, because you highlight several dissenters at different times in the series, and at the same time you sort of highlight how they were minimized or diminished in some cases or ignored. And so I'm curious, it sounds like part of what you're describing is the necessity for dissent, but how, given the nature of the system that you described, how does dissent rise up enough to assert power in its own way?
What was the last part of the question?
Just how does dissent go from something that can be minimized to something that has power?
By exhibition. By exhibition. The original fellow who operated, he was an epileptic around 1910 or something like that. He was epileptic. He was, theories of the brain. There was a left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And they had to operate, they saved him. He was dying, I think. And they saved him by cutting out half his brain. Of course, that was, by the theory, the other half of the brain would never, he could only have one of the two halves in theory, but in reality, the brain is a sponge, and it grew in a new way, and was able to maintain the same capacity as the normal time. So I think dissidents bring that out. That's what they do. They shock. They cut through the Solzhenitsyn of the world. The fellows who go into psychiatric clinics in the old Soviet Union, or who go to Guantanamo, or who in America, I mean, we do have a very strange system of getting the people. They kind of disappear into the system. But it's really, Ed Snowden shocked us, and Tom Drake did, and Julian Assange and Bradley Manning. These are good things. These are very good things. We need these things. This is what Nathan Hale did, and ultimately Washington, the American Revolution. We have to strike out and boldly communicate it. Martin Luther King. That was a question.
And Martin Luther King's a good example, because as Ella Baker says, the movement, that Martin Luther King didn't make the movement made Martin Luther King. And the same thing with Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't Franklin Roosevelt who brought the reform, it was the labor movement and the other uprisings during the 1930s that made Franklin Roosevelt possible. Barack Obama said the same thing. He said, if you want to do the right thing, you're going to have to force me. People mobilized behind him on every college campus and community around the country in 2008, seeing him as a voice of real change. But then he demobilized the movement very deliberately and demoralized his followers. One of the things we're up against now is that the campuses are still doing a lot of voluntary work, voluntarism, but they're not mobilized politically. I think they're partly demoralized ever since Obama broke their hearts in 2008. The other problem we run into in the United States, especially since, well, it goes deep way back for the 19th century, earlier, is the equation of dissent with disloyalty. Instead of seeing dissent as the highest form of patriotism, which is what it really is, trying to get this country to live up to its ideals, dissenters are somehow seen as un-American or anti-American. We get accused of being anti-American. We're just the opposite of that. We're trying to hold up America's potential and say, this is what this country could be in the world, playing a positive role. So that's another thing we're up against. But the mood is out there. We saw it with Occupy. It has flaws, obviously, but it caught a certain mood quickly in the country, and things can change very, very quickly, as we've seen in other countries too.
Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Start right from the back.
One thing we can do is go Google on Pass Mass, go to Pass Mass Amendment, change the Massachusetts Constitution so that corporations are not people in Massachusetts. And the federal one is move to amend to change the United States Constitution, so they can't totally give unlimited amounts of money to politicians.
Thank you for your statement. Would you like to respond to this statement?
I don't know the Massachusetts law, but that sounds cool.
Sir.
I'm a member of the most exceptional country in the world. Thank God I'm a United States citizen. Do you want to see your book adopted by all schools starting preschool, etc.? And when are you going to make a movie about the revolution and criticizing the Constitution that I believe in that they're trying to change?
Well, that's a big order. I am working on the Snowden movie. Hopefully it'll be done. But it obviously deals with the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, especially the Fourth Amendment. That whole wiretapping. So to the first question, which was,
You want to see our book?
well, that's complicated. We can't, we have a 10 and up, as Peter said, a 10 and up Young Readers Edition, which is coming out in December, and we have a concise Untold History, which is out this last week, which is easier reading. But we went to the, we do go to the high schools. They are allowed to show, in public schools, allowed to show a chapter, the documentary, but they're not allowed, I think, by most laws, to force the students to read the text. So it's a very difficult political decision. The University of Texas, University of California school boards are the two most powerful school boards in the country, huge boards. And we have approached the University of California school board last year. We had a lot of supporters. But by the time the process is pretty much on its way, we would have spent like an extra $250,000, which we didn't have, to put this into play. You have to lobby, and you have to get labor on your side. Labor unions were on our side. But there's always going to be dissent, and if you get enough dissent against the book, because it is controversial, which we figured we'd get, we didn't think we'd make it to the school board.
Right in the back.
Well, from the perspective of historians and researchers of history, do you guys believe that we are still a country or an empire? And how is it that we have to change the way we speak about this so that we can actually bring reality into life in whichever way we are, right?
We're a crumbling empire with an enormous muscle. It's scary because the empire, as it crumbles, you don't have the power you really think we have. You only have military power because it's what we can use. Our economic power too, we can use it. But as we crumble, as we get weaker, the fear is that we would lash out. That's when we become dangerous. The rising empires of China, perhaps the Russian Empire, the Iranian Empire, these things would threaten us. We would lash out. That's my fear.
Yeah, I agree. When you have a crumbling empire that's armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, that to me is very, very frightening. Every other empire that's ever existed has collapsed. The United States is not going to be an exception in that regard. But no other empire had the power to bring the world down with it the way that we do now. So that's very dangerous. But you look again how quickly things change. A decade ago, the New York Times Sunday Magazine section, January 5th, 2003, front page headline story, American Empire, get used to it. You had all the neocons who were so full of themselves a decade ago, talking about our war against the world and that we're the most powerful empire ever and nobody can possibly challenge us ever again. At the end of history, Fukuyama, and that kind of jingoistic thinking, so shallow and so quickly eclipsed. So the world changes quickly. And we argue throughout this entire documentary series that it's really a history of the American empire and national security state, which is why we started in the 1890s. We see a lot of this starting with the Spanish-American War. When the United States intervenes in the Philippines to overthrow the popular Aguinaldo government, the United States positioned itself really for the first time as a counter-revolutionary nation. And throughout the 20th century, we become the leading counter-revolutionary nation. That's not our history. We go back to the revolution, as that gentleman suggests. We see that the United States was once in the forefront of fighting for freedom and for Republican governments. And that's what we'd like to see us get back to. And yes, an empire definitely, but a crumbling